Hello, everyone. Our chapter 2, is called Legacy of Inequality, Colonial Roots. It opens up with the poem that we just read, Contribution to Our Museum by Marge Piercy. In the poem, she references to items or moments of luxury that overshadow the harsh truth of the people and their conditions behind them. For example, the cut diamonds that are hardened by the choking miners who mine them, the rubies that bleed with the cries of the starving women who harvest them. She also points out that she cannot learn French history without reading whole chapters dedicated to King Louis and the guillotine, yet the 50,000 peasants that starved are just mentioned as a footnote. And she asks, how can she love Mount Vernon, which is Washington's estate, with its beautiful views and its slave quarters? This poem opens the conversation that needs to be had in order to get to the root of global economic disparity, which is invasion and colonialism that originated with Europe. The next section is for us to understand what can happen to a country before and after colonialism and development. The editors used Brazil as an example. If we think about the Brazil that we are familiar with, we tend to think of the tourist attraction parts, which are beautiful. But we can also picture the rampant poverty and the decline of the economy. However, it wasn't always like that. There are a couple quotes from letters of eyewitness accounts from the 1500s that describe Brazil in a different way. The first one from 1500 says, "The people are stronger and better fed than we are. They are well cared for and very clean. And in this way, they seem to me rather like birds. Their bodies are so plump and so beautiful that they could not be more so." The other quote is from 1503, which says, "They exist on a succulent diet of exotic fruits, herbs, game, and an infinity of fish. This is a delightful land with brightly colored birds, evergreen trees that yield the sweetest aromatic fragrances, and an infinite variety of fruit. I fancied myself to be near the terrestrial paradise." So that's very different from the present day Brazil that we think about. According to research from Nancy Shepherd Hughes from the early 1990s, she says of Brazil after colonialism and development, "Today, the northeast region of Brazil is one of the poorest areas in the world. Scenes of hunger, disease, and child death are commonplace. 2/3 of all rural children suffer stunted growth from inadequate food. Hunger has made the people lean, nervous, and desperate. The Brazilian press refers to the region as the Valley of Death, and even all the fish are gone." What a stark contrast between the Brazil from then and the Brazil from now. How did it change so much? How did it go from being a terrestrial paradise to a valley of death? The simplest explanation is colonialism. So, as we can see, colonialism isn't something that just happened in the US. We tend to think of colony in the British colonies in America, the American Revolution, Great Britain, Britain versus America, but that's not it. It's not just an American thing, it's a European thing generally, and they essentially colonized the whole world. The Americas, Africa, Asia, you name it, they've probably colonized it. The text tries to explain what they consider the building blocks of colonialism in 6 basic steps, using Asian countries as the focus for the example. The first step would be grabbing the cash, or in this case, looting Asia, and it was basically taking their resources for themselves. So the Asian colonies, the Asian colonies were once rich in natural resources, crops, mines, and forests, but the money that was being made from them were being shipped off to Europe instead of developing their own industries and economies. So, for example, from 1850 to 1872, the Dutch East Indies, or as we now know it, Indonesia, contributed to about a third of the total budget of Holland, which helped them reduce their national debts and construct state railways. However, Indonesia was left with almost no money for themselves. The second building block they call the raw deal, and it is exporting crops to Europe. So the problem with growing crops and exporting them to Europe is that these families or these people usually had enough land to feed themselves and their families. And they were suddenly being told that they needed to grow crops to send to Europe instead of feeding themselves. So you can imagine that a lot of them went hungry. Also, the prices that they were set to sell were very low, so they made very little money. And what most of the money that they did make had to go back into paying the heavy taxes that were imposed by the Europeans. And on top of all of that, the Europeans also organized the colonies in such a way that they made sure that only that each one would only grow about 2 or 3 different types of crops. With no variety, there was no way for them to expand economic growth. The third building block they call the craft crash, or the de-skilling of Asia. Basically, this division of labor not only affected the agricultural workers, but also affected the craftspeople and the manufacturers, or the skilled laborers. What the Europeans made sure to do was force the Asian colonies to only produce the raw materials for products at very low prices, but then ban them from manufacturing anything with the products, with the materials. So they could not make their own products. They had to buy the manufactured products from the mother country at very high prices. This created dependency on the Europeans for goods and products. And if any skilled workers tried to run their own business, they would be discouraged through heavy taxes, and they made sure the latest machinery was only available in Europe and would not come into Asia. So this obviously put a full stop from hoping to increase their skills and wages and making themselves independent from the colonizers. The fourth building block was drawing the line, or making a division between the people. The colonialists purposely put together groups of people in the nation who had very little in common, or if they did have a lot in common, then they made sure that there was a clear line drawn between them. So for example, in the Dutch East Indies, there was a group of people called the Ambonese, and they were used by the Europeans as soldiers to suppress the other Indonesian people. So when Indonesia finally declared its independency, the Ambonese people were so hated by them that they had to flee to Holland as refugees. It was basically a divide and conquer tactic. They needed to encourage distrust and create hate between the people so that they would not rally together to kick the colonizers out. The fifth building block is called holding up hierarchies, because they needed to know how to keep the Asian people under control. What they did was use military might to establish a few power leaders in position, obviously not chosen by the people, that would help support the colonialist cause, even if it was against their people's wishes. So this is how they held themselves in the hierarchy and kept the Asian people under their thumb. And the final building block is what I feel is the most sinister. Put simply, they called it West is best. Basically, it's saying that it indoctrinates the people to accept the European way of life and doing things, and completely eradicating their own culture and identity. So if a people cannot remember who they are, they cannot revolt against their oppressors. The next section is titled Burning Books and Destroying Peoples, and it describes how the world became divided between rich and poor countries. It gives a brief history of how colonialism became a global phenomenon. The text defines colonialism as a system of control by a country over an area or people outside its borders. Modern colonialism really began in the late 1400s, when those people in power in European countries thought that they might become even richer and more powerful by trading goods with other parts of the world. So the rich people in Portugal wanted to trade with India and China. Along the way, they came across the rich African coast, where they found lots of spices, porcelain, and ivory. However, the problem was that they didn't want anything from Portugal besides, metal pots and pans. Portugal produced guns, but they did not want to supply those to anyone else. So what they did to solve this issue of them not wanting to trade with Portugal was that on their next voyage, they armed their ships and soldiers with those guns, sent them to Africa, and forced the Africans and Asians to trade with them in the form of looting and stealing. Eventually, the African cities along the coast were in ruins, and Portugal controlled basically almost all ocean based trading between Europe, Africa, and Asia, while the wealth all flowed once again into Europe. Shortly after, the expansion of the Spaniards across the Americas took place, stealing the lands from millions of native people. They wanted the same thing, to steal vast quantities of gold and silver to enrich just a small number of people in Europe. They also wanted the native peoples to work for them for almost no pay so that they can take the products for themselves. This inspired other large nations such as England, France, and Holland to send their own ships around the world and claim land and people as their own. However, in the Americas, since so many natives fought their enslavement and often were able to escape, the European colonists had to solve their lack of labor by stealing millions of Africans in what we now term the Middle Passage and really kickstarting the slave trade. The colonialists were, of course, met with resistance to their oppression in most of the nations. Native people, for example, in the Americas resisted for many years, and some nations were even able to win their independence, like the slaves in Haiti who rebelled and kicked out the French, or much of the Latin American countries who, with the leadership of Simon Bolivar, were able to kick out the Spanish as well. Sadly, the results of resistance were not the same throughout the world. They were mostly crushed by the more militarily advanced European armies and navies. Then the wealth of those continents were sent back once again to Europe, which in turn made them even more powerful and more able to continue their domination of the world. Because of the riches obtained by colonialism, the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century was able to begin, and the tremendous increase in the use of machines allowed European countries to extend their power even further in a second wave of colonialism. By mid-century, the British controlled all of India, while basically the entire continent of Africa was being divided among the European powers of 1885. So Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, and Belgium all laid claim to the lands. And as quoted from the text, one colonialist referred to the continent that was being greedily sliced up as this magnificent African cake. With settling and colonizing came the demand for products and resources, while simultaneously destroying the people and the culture. Then, as discussed earlier in the chapter, they hit them with the building block number 2 and number 3, the raw deal and the craft crash. They forced people to produce cash crops, no matter how low the prices were by taxing them, and then telling them that they could only get the money to pay them back the taxes if they grew the cash crops that the Europeans wanted. And some even took it a little bit further by banning certain things like hunting, for example, so that the people would have to focus on cultivating cotton. Then they de-skilled the countries by taking the cotton from them, but banning them from processing the cotton into clothing. That way they had to buy the clothing, like we said, made in England, which was more expensive, thus forcing the artisans out of business and making the country poorer. Finally, it is extremely important to acknowledge that colonialism was not just done by the Europeans, but also done by us in the United States. We eventually became a colonial power when we fought and seized a third of Mexico, fought bloody battles to annex Hawaii, and then acquired Puerto Rico, the Philippines, which we later lost, and Guam. It wasn't until after World War II, which wasn't that long ago as we know, that the countries of Asia and Africa were able to force a weakened Europe to begin granting them independence. So not only are the effects and implications of global colonialism a recent thing, it is still ongoing. Many of these countries are still in debt to wealthy nations. Because of colonialism, many countries in the third world still have to rely on one or two main crops and have never fully developed industrially. For example, the fact that the Spaniards took almost all the gold and silver from the Americas is connected to today's widespread hunger in South America. So you can think back to that example provided of Brazil then and Brazil now. And worst of all is the loss of culture of these nations that occurred because of the literal book burning of their own historical documents and their own histories. So, to sum up, this is how you essentially destroy a people and divide the world's countries into rich and poor.